After the workshop, she has me cleaning the bathrooms.
You got it,
My name's Bob Darrell. I'm an alcoholic. I'd like to start with a prayer I've found very useful for me. Lord, help me to set aside everything I think I know about you, everything I think I know about myself, everything I think I know about others, and everything I think I know about my own recovery, all for a new experience in you, Lord, a new experience in myself, a new experience in my fellows, and a much-needed new experience in my own recovery. Amen. I didn't know what, I've been struggling. I didn't know what to do this workshop on. I had a sneaking feeling it was somehow going to be about me. But I wasn't real sure how to angle it in. But I had suspected that it would be something about me. And I thought, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I do a lot of workshops on the traditions and the steps and things like that. And this is going to be a little bit about the steps. But from the approach of what I've come to believe that Alcoholics Anonymous is really about, it's designed to do one thing primarily, and that's to allow me to carry out a desperate decision I made in step 3. It's about surrender. And before I ever got sober, I had people in Alcoholics Anonymous telling me I needed to surrender, and I didn't know what they were talking about. Surrender has been an element in AA since the very beginning, since before AA existed. If you know the story of Roland Hazard and Ebby Thatcher, when Ebby went on, drank again, or not Ebby Thatcher, Roland Hazard and Carl Jung, when Roland Hazard drank again and ended up back at Jung's clinic, and he was hopeless, and Jung told him, he said, "There's nothing we can do for you." And he's the top of the food chain for human power, greatest psychiatrist in the world at the time. He said, "There's nothing we can do for you." And Roland says, "Well, my God, there's got to be something." And Carl Jung told him, he said, "Well, there's been incidences throughout history of alcoholics of your type where a phenomenon occurs. They have a conversion or spiritual experience." And they've been telling guys like me for years, for centuries, give up. And we look at them like, give up what? You mean give up the drinking, don't you? Well, I can give up drinking for weeks and weeks until I can't give it up no more. There was Bill Wilson had a spiritual experience in Towns Hospital December 14th, 1935. And he had his wind blew through the room, white light experience. And this is not an uncommon experience. Alcoholics have had those experiences for centuries. And out of that experience, he got a feeling, in a sense, that the problem had been solved. And thank God that an event occurred to him, occurred at that time, that probably is why we're here. He was given a copy of a book by William James called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And if you've ever tried to read The Varieties of Religious Experience, it's a very hard book to read. I've read twice in my sobriety. In my first few years, I tried to read it, and it was like another language. And several years ago, I went back and read it. And I wonder if Bill Wilson's experience reading it in Towns Hospital was the same as I had when I was sober a long time. Bill was a bright guy. And what I discovered, and I suspect it might be the same thing that he discovered, that as William James did this chronicle of people who had surrendered conversion experiences, he found a commonality of two things in all these experiences invariably. The first thing is you never had a surrendered conversion experience when your life's on a roll. It just don't happen. I mean, you've never just came back from Vegas with 2 showgirls and the Mega Bucks jackpot and you go, "I want to find God." I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. Usually these experiences happen when you're just completely broken and demoralized. And then the second thing, and I think this is why we're here, this was the turning point, is that he also realized that those experiences invariably were transitory experiences. They didn't last. That for some strange reason, these conversion, born-again experiences, the shine would eventually wear off of them, and the old behavior would reassert itself. That's why in my home group, if you were to do a show of hands of people, anybody here that's been saved and then drank again, you'll see a whole bunch of hands go up because the shine of the experience wears off. And Alcoholics Anonymous, in my experience, is a set of principles and a fellowship in action that, when practiced, allows me to keep... It doesn't allow me to get back exactly to the surrender experience I had in the hospital in 1978, but it keeps me in the zip code, right? It keeps me in the zip code of I run the show and then I make amends, and then I run a show and then I make amends. You know what I mean? It keeps me in that area so that I don't have to prolong the stance of having self in the driver's seat to my own destruction. I'd like to talk. I'm going to read couple little pieces in the book. So the problem for me is defined in we agnostics as lack of power. And isn't that a weird thing for a guy like me to come to a place where I realize lack of power is my dilemma, but it's not lack of religion, and it's not even lack of faith. I've had the occasion to, over the years, I've got to work with several members of clergy. Two of them literally drank themselves to death, weeping that God had forsaken them. And they prayed more, read more spiritual literature in a week than I probably do in 6 months. Isn't that weird? If what they say in AA is true, that we're sober only through the grace of God, I mean, wouldn't you think these guys would have a leg up on the rest of us? These men of the cloth that devoted themselves to... But it's not, the problem is not lack of religion or lack of faith, it's lack of power. And the problem that I face is that I cut myself off from this power. And I must revitalize the connection on a regular basis. In probably 1976, I ended up in coming to in a jail cell, and I didn't remember why I was arrested, which is not an unusual experience for an alcoholic. Usually about the time we really can properly counsel police, we're too drunk to remember doing it later. But I'm in this jail cell and I'm sick, and I'm sitting on this bunk and I'm rocking back and forth, and I gotta get a drink, man. I'm jumping out of my skin. And this guard comes down, he takes me out of the room, and he takes me up to this room where there's this detective there. And the detective proceeds to tell me that the reason I'm there is that the night before, with a hunting knife with a blade about this long, my only friend on the planet I have left, I've opened up his chest with that knife. And he's in intensive care and he's dying. And he's saying that to me. I'm looking at my blue jeans and I realize that they're purple with his blood. And I remember these emotions coming over me. And it was a feeling as if I am about to start screaming. And if I do, I will never stop. And I pushed those emotions down in me with everything in me, and I pushed them down, and I hardened up, and I went back to that jail cell, and I collapsed, and I started sobbing. And on the concrete floor in a jail cell, I got down on my knees, and I begged God, don't ever let me drink that stuff again. And I got drunk the day I got out. The day I got out. So when I come to Alcoholics Anonymous and I hear people talk about they're sober through God's grace, I got a problem here, because I am absolutely convinced, well, that's nice for you, but there's obviously something really wrong with me, that this grace is not available. Maybe I'm too bad, or I'm too despicable, or too self-centered, or too something. And people in Alcoholics Anonymous tried to tell me, no, that's not true. Your grace is available to you. I think that was true. I think it wasn't available to me, but not because it was shut off at the source. I saw a movie probably 15, 20 years ago on TV. It was an old World War II movie, and it really gave me a tremendous insight into this aspect of grace, which I think is free flow of power in the universe. It's unmerited. And what the movie was about, it was about in the South Pacific. In the South Pacific during World War II, there was so many islands there that the United States did not have the manpower to station garrisons of troops on all those islands. There's just too many of them. So what they often did is they would parachute in an observer who would set up a base camp with equipments and a radio, etc., and he would keep in touch with the fleet and monitor any kind of Japanese troop movements and then contact the United States fleet. Well, the movie's about this guy who parachutes into this island, but something happens to the radio when he's parachuting in. And what he sets up his base camp, and he starts to turn the radio on to get contact with the fleet, and he can't get the fleet. There's something wrong with the radio. And no matter how much he screws around with the antenna, no matter what he does and where he positions the radio and turns the knobs, he can't get the message in. Can't get the juice. So he goes about the business of surveying the island and fortifying his camp and et cetera, et cetera. And then one day he's coming over a sand dune, and the ocean, the bay's right there, and there's the Japanese fleet. And they're coming towards his island. And he panics, and he runs back to his base camp frantically trying to screw with the radio, and he can't get the signal in, and he's desperate. And he remembers that there was a manual somewhere, and he's digging through this duffel bag. At the very bottom of the duffel bag, he pulls out this manual, this radio manual. And he starts reading the radio manual, and it describes the symptoms that's wrong with the radio. And it gives you a very step-by-step process of repair, and he starts to repair the manual, or the radio from the manual, and all of a sudden there's the fleet. The signal was there. And the signal had not been held back from him because he had a bad radio where he played with his knobs too much or anything like that. It was simply he had a broken receiver. And I think what happens to guys like me who have alcoholism, this disease of obsessive self-involvement, is that I'm cut off from God because I have a broken, faulty, malfunctioning receiver to His grace. His grace, which is my inheritance, is my divine right. On page 55 of the big book, it talks about this, and it talks about this power. And it says, there's two paragraphs in the middle of the page that are very prophetic, because it really will tell you what's going to happen as the result of these steps. It'll tell you exactly how, exactly where, and exactly when you'll find God. I heard a Catholic priest one time who was sober a long time doing a retreat, a guy who had taught theology, and he said that he'd been lost from God until he read this chapter, and he said it blew his mind. And this is a guy who's 30 years teaching theology. And on the middle of page 55, it says, "We are fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured, which means blocked off, by calamity." We all know what calamity is. We're a kind of we're producers of confusion rather than harmony. I mean, we're just like, we just like to tweak life until it tweaks back. You know what I mean? We're just like that. I don't know what it is about me. I've never seen a scenario in life I didn't think I could improve. You know what I mean? Right? And I produce calamity because I'm the guy running the show. I'm the actor who wants to run the whole show. I'm that guy. Father Martin says a great a great thing. In one of his talks, he says, you can go anywhere anywhere people meet, whether it's family gatherings, committees, workplaces, and you can always pick out the alcoholics with alcoholism when they're sober. He said, don't look for the drinking. Look for the person who everyone walks on eggshells around, right? And we're producers of confusion. I'm a calamity kind of guy. I just, something about the action of, I'm almost addicted to the action of spinning in my head about life, just trying to figure it all out. That illusion of power that I get when I'm in here running the scenarios. Okay, they're going to say this, and then I'm going to say that, and then they're going to say this, and then I'm going to hit them with that. It's going to bring them to their knees. They're going to realize how right Bob had been. I just live like that. So whether I'm producing calamity out here or in here, I'm a producer of calamity. It says we're also obscured by pomp. Well, I think that's another word for ego, is I get so full of myself. I'm like a glass of water. Full to the top, there's no room for anything else. I think that I can be so full of me that I am unreachable from God. I believe God's first and greatest, sometimes worst, depending on your position, gift to me was my free will. And God's not an Indian giver. He's never taken it back. If I want to be so wrapped up in my judgments, in my opinion, in my will, and my stuff, that there's no room for him in my life, he just must wait patiently till that changes. He doesn't intrude. He never has. And then the last thing it says is worship of other things. Now, this was a hard deal for me to see. You could have put me on a lie detector in early sobriety and say, now that you're sober, Bob, do you worship anything? I said, absolutely not. I could have possibly conceded that when drinking, I may have worshipped alcohol a little bit, or at least acted like somebody, but I don't worship anything really. And I worshipped a lot and didn't even know it. And I was about a year and a half sober probably, and I was coming out of my first sober relationship. Now, I got to tell you something. I don't think there's a person on the planet more self-obsessed than an alcoholic ending a relationship. You can go up to a guy like that and say, I just came from the doctor. I have terminal cancer and 3 weeks to live. And he'll go, you know what else she said, man? Really? The most dreaded phone call a sponsor ever gets is, oh, I found God's will at the meeting. Does this like want to say, buckle up? So I'm ending this relationship, and I'm nuts. I'm a nutcase. Because that's all I'm thinking about. And I'm in this meeting, right? And I don't know about you guys, but God talks to me often through people, sometimes within myself through that intuitive portal, that portal to the divine where I can hear that still small voice. But when you've got something like that going on, you're cut off. And I can't. I pray, and all I think about is what I pray, and in the middle of the prayer, I'm thinking about what I really ought to say to her, and what she'd say, and then I'll hit her with this, and she'll realize how wrong she is, and be properly ashamed of herself, and come begging back. And just when you're full of that stuff, it's hard to have a connection with God. And the same as in meetings, because one of the problems is she's a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm in this late night meeting, and she's not in the meeting. So what that means is that some hideous force has implanted a spring in the back of my neck, and every time the door to the meeting hall opens up, I go like this, like that. Now, it's hard. God could be trying to talk to me through the people in the meeting. I can't hear nothing. So the meeting's over. I ended up going out to coffee with a guy from Glendale who was visiting. He was sober 28 years. And I'm sitting in this coffee shop, and I'm telling him about this relationship for 20 or 30 minutes till his eyes have glazed over. I mean, just on and on. And he sat very patiently and listened to me. And when I was done, he said some things that just rocked my world. He said, "Kid, you ever thought about the first commandment?" And I said, nah, I'm not really into that. I'm just into AA. He said, yeah, I know. He says, you and I, he says, guys like us, we're a lot alike. We never get past the thou shalt not. And he said the Ten Commandments, he says, I believe were originally written as statements of spiritual cause and effect. And when they were translated into the Greek, they got an authoritarian spin put on them. He said, but the first commandment as exists in the English today is, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have false gods before me. He says, I think it's completely okay with God for you to do that. You can put anything you want between you and God. God will still love you. It's absolutely up to you. The problem is, you've just put something between you and God. You've just obscured the light. And he said, if you want to know what, when you do that, and when you worship other things, he says, worship doesn't mean to bow down to. Worship means simply to obsessively turn your consciousness towards. He said, you don't want to know what you worship? At the end of the day, make a pie graph of everything you've been thinking about, and the thing that owns the pie is the thing you've been obsessively turning your consciousness towards. And when he said that, I could picture this pie graph with a little sliver for AA, a little sliver for work, and the rest of the damn pie was her. And I wish I could stand here and tell you from that moment I've never done that again, but I'll tell you the pie has been dominated over the years by a lot of stuff. It's about sometimes by things I want to be right about judgments about people. Sometimes it's dominated by the people in AA that aren't doing it right. Sometimes it's dominated by money or fear of the lack of it. Sometimes about getting my own way on a committee or at work or in some area of my life, or not getting something I think I have to have, and the people that stand in my way. Or the fear of losing something I can't imagine living without. And I obsessively turn my consciousness towards those things, and they own me. Chuck Chamberlain, I heard him talk one time, and he looked at the audience and he laughed and he said, what controls you? What controls you? And a lot controlled me. And a lot blocked me off from God. So I'm obscured, I'm blocked off from this power by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things. But the book says, but in some form or other, it's there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly. Fearless and searching moral inventory of ourselves. But he was there after the searching and fearlessness. If you've ever read that new biography of Frank Buckman, one of the founders of the Oxford Group, the Oxford Group believed that you couldn't turn your will and life over to the care of God until after you cleaned house. They believed it was impossible. Matter of fact, the story of one of Buckman's transformations was he was a washed-up minister. And he had a desire to be close to God and help God's kids, but the bedevilments on page 52 where it says, trouble with personal relationships, couldn't control our emotional nature, prey to misery and depression, couldn't make a living, had a feeling of uselessness, were all characteristics that would have fit Frank Buckman, and he wasn't an alcoholic at that time. And he was over in England, and some guy came up to him, and he's in a low spot, and said to him, let's go down to the Salvation Army down on Skid Row in London and listen to this woman testify. And because he was in a low spot, he went, which is remarkable, because I'll tell you about Buckman. Buckman thought all spiritual stuff came through men. So that was a big step for him to go listen to a woman. And also, he had this thing about he thought spirituality was expressed by abundance. So to go at Skid Row to hear a message was a new concept. Matter of fact, even in later years when the Oxford Group tried to encourage Bill Wilson to convert captains of industry, and Bill just wanted to go work with the drunks down at the mission. But so he goes down to this Salvation Army in London, and he hears this woman talking exactly about him, about being blocked from God, being blocked from God's kids, being in a state of isolation, unable to affect any usefulness in his life, being lost and alone. And she said, when you're disconnected from God, the answer is not to turn up the prayer and to turn up this. The answer is to remove the blockage, is to search fearlessly within yourself What is between you and God? And he had never heard that, and that became one of the. And her thing was, you can't turn your will and your life over to the care of God as long as something's in the way. And isn't that in the fifth? It's not until the fifth step promises that it says that we will begin to experience the nearness of our Creator. It's until after I've done the fearless and searching, after I've dismantled the judgment machine in the resentment section, that really is where I primarily play God. Putting down everybody in life and building my cases and in my mind doing the scenarios that really the end bottom line is they feel the wrath of Bob. Right? All the revenge scenarios. So sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. Where? Deep down within me. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality. And what, in capital letters, what a tremendous term for God or for this power. The great reality. As it says in chapter 5, we only find this in now. And reality exists in the moment. It's not yesterday. It's not tomorrow. The great reality is always right here, right now. That we found the great reality in the last place I would have ever imagined, deep down within me. Do you ever go, when you're new, do you ever hearing people talk about meditation? Do you ever, when you're new, go home and try that? Oh my God. I was sitting in a meeting one time, and there was some woman sober a long time who had obviously worked the steps. And she was talking about how she just liked to be alone without the TV or radio, just alone, communing with herself and God. And it just sounded so great. I thought to myself, yeah, I'm going to do that. And I went home and I didn't turn the stereo on or the TV. And I'm just going to commune with me and God. And I'll tell you something. When it gets quiet out here, it gets noisy in here. And after about 30 seconds, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to turn the TV on. It was driving me crazy. Because it starts, it says, what does it mean? What does God mean? Oh, it just drives me. It's like, with untreated, the mind of a chronic alcoholic with untreated alcoholism is like being trapped in this small container with a group of ADD children that are just off their medication. So when the old timers would talk about communing with the God within, I don't run into God when I go inside. I run into a pack of crazy people. I run into Legion. Oh God, it's just nuts. But I'm blocked. I got too much of me between me and me and me and God. I can't commune with me and I can't commune with God. I'm too blocked. We found the great reality deep down within us, and it says in the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. And God, that was so painfully true for me. I sponsor a few guys that got sober and went right to the steps, and their life turned around and they're doing great. But that was not my experience. I went to great lengths, first of all, to avoid coming to AA. I tried every type of therapy. I tried religion. I tried every type of drug. I tried changing towns, relationships, jobs. I threw everything at the beast that was available on this planet. And the end result is I have to go, I'm in AA. And then after getting to AA, I sought power everywhere else except deep down within me. And I sought it there everywhere else because in little flyers into myself, I don't run into God. I run into insanity, but I have not unblocked the channel. I'm obscured. And so I sought power in job, in money, in relationships. I sought it in service positions, in Alcoholics Anonymous. I sought it by going to 20 meetings a week, trying to outrun the vacancy in the middle of my being. Because when I was with you, I was a lot better than when I was just with me. And I couldn't outrun my alcoholism. And finally, at 4.5 years sober, I went through this process and these steps, and I connected with something that has been a part of my life ever since. I connected with it prior to that briefly and short spurts in 12-step work, but it would fade, just like William James talked about the invariably fading of the connection. It would fade so easily within me. This great reality, in the last analysis, it was only there that it can be found after I've looked everywhere else, and then I come back to the steps as they're outlined in the book at 4.5 years sober. And about 5 years sober, a guy that I was working for gave me a set of tapes. Not AA. This is trying to make me a better employee. This was right around the time I was going through some changes. And I was hitting a bottom with my alcoholism in the rooms of AA. And the set of tapes, it's not that I'm a bad employee. I just really get what's wrong with people so easily. I think I'm really the only good employee he has, but I'm the guy everybody's walking on eggshells around, right? And I'm not effective with customers, this is my 9th job in 4.5 years. Get the picture? So he gives me this set of tapes. It's called Lead the Field, and it's not AA stuff. It's just motivational stuff to make you a better employee. And this guy, Earl Nightingale, tells this story on this tape that just blows my mind. And he says it's a true story. And the story's about this guy in South Africa who was inherited a ranch. And it was a nice ranch, a ranch that could have made a nice living for him and his family for years and years and years. But not mega rich, but just comfortable. But he inherited this ranch at a time when the diamond boom is on in South Africa. And he's hearing these stories of people in his community becoming around the country, becoming mega Rockefeller, Bill Gates rich overnight. And the more he hears the story of their extreme abundance, the more dissatisfied he becomes with his ranch and his own life. Till finally he can't take it anymore and he sells the ranch, takes the money from the sale, and goes out into the bush obsessed with striking it rich and finding diamonds. And he never does. And he dies out there bitter, broke, and alone. And it came to pass that this ranch was sold to these brothers who were developers, and they're clearing some land one day, and they pull this big boulder aside, and there's these weird rocks there, and they don't know what they are, and they're weird looking, and they take them, analyze them, and they find out they're diamonds. And they found out that this ranch was the largest diamond deposit ever discovered in South Africa. And these brothers all of a sudden are like two of the richest guys on the planet, and they're just overwhelmed. They have all of a sudden create this huge corporation to mine and cut and market and distribute diamonds throughout the world. And one day after this, they're just putting this all together. The one brother says to the other, we need to name our company something. What do we name it? And the other brother says, let's name it after that poor son of a bitch we bought this ranch from. What was his name? Wasn't it De Beers? And they named the company after that guy. And I'm reading that story. I'm listening to the tapes, and I'm listening to Earl tell this story, and I'm thinking, I'm that idiot. I'm that guy. I'm looking everywhere else for power because it just makes sense to me that it's out here somewhere, because I'm a victim of an illusion, a delusion it talks about in chapter 5. The delusion that I can wrest happiness and satisfaction out of this world if I only manage well. If I can just get all my ducks lined up in a row. If I'm properly financed. If I can make people see things the right way. If I have the right amount of love in my life. It's not enough that you love me. You have to love me the right way. And it changes continually. Because what I miss, I have to tweak the perception, because when you do finally love me the wrong way after I look at it a little closely, that's not really the right way. Because I got this vacancy inside of me, right? So I'm looking everywhere else, and the answer is deep within inside me, but the problem is I'm blocked. And I spent my first 4.5 years of sobriety. I did an inventory, the life story kind, and was still blocked. You know, where you talk about all your shame and guilt. Nothing changed. And the problem is I'm pretty serious about step 3. But as it says in our book, on the bottom of page 63, the top of 64, right after taking the 3rd step prayer, it says we launched out on a course of vigorous action, of which a personal house cleaning, which many of us never attempted. Though our decision in step 3 was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves that have been blocking us. And that's why I think I used to share in meetings my first few years. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I turn it over and take it back and turn it over and take it back. The problem is I'm blocked from turning it over. I'm blocked from letting God have it. What I'm really trying to do, and I don't understand it, is that I'm serious about giving God my life, but unbeknownst to me, I'm retaining my will, which is my judgment of my life, of how I think it should go and the way people should treat me and what should happen. So when I say to God in the 3rd step prayer, I offer myself to you for you to build with me and do with me, I'm not really serious about that. I'm really saying for you to build with me and do with me as I will. And if you turn your life over to God and you still retain the judgment machine that is your will, it's like saying, God, here's my life, but there's a list coming of how it better go. Right? And what's depression? I suffered severely from depression early sobriety. Depression's when God stops doing your will. Right? And I suffered from bouts of anxiety, the anxiety of playing God. I was the judgmental guy. In the 3rd step, it says, first of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. I used to go to my sponsor in early sobriety with these mental lists of the people that are out of line. The guys at work that are stealing and coming late, and they don't really do their share of the work, and the people in AA that are out of line. So-and-so selling Amway in the parking lot, and so-and-so doesn't put any money in the basket, and she's just looking for a husband, and he's a 13-stepper, and he lies in meetings, and what's he trying to... He sounds like a Hallmark card in a recovery bookstore. I can't stand it. And I'd have these lists of the people that are screwed up in AA, and he'd always say the same thing to me. He'd say, you got to quit playing God. I think, I'm not playing God. I'm reporting accurate information here. I'm not playing God. And I was playing God. I climbed up onto the throne of judgment. I'm under the illusion that I've given God my life, and I am so entrenched in my judgment and my perception and perspective of life because I'm still running the show in here. And I'm conflicted because I'm running it in here and trying to act like I'm not running it out here. That'll make you a little crazy. Because you got to run the universe, but look like you're not. And in step 3, there's a part it's funny. It's talking about the actor who wants to run the whole show. And it says, in trying to make these arrangements, our actor may be sometimes quite virtuous. He may be kind, considerate, patient, generous, even modest, and self-sacrificing. Look at all the service I do, God. And I always, in this effort to arrange life to suit myself, I always try the high road first. And the book says if that doesn't work, we are just as capable of being mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest. But I always try the high road first because in this obsessive quest to arrange life so I'll be okay and my holes will be filled, I always try the high road because if that works, you get your way and you look good doing it. I mean, that's a hat trick. That's hitting it out of the park. But I'm also just as capable of gossiping about you. It's not really gossip. I'm sharing things with people that they really need to know in case they ever need to help this person. What do we do at coffee? First thing you sit down and say, did you hear about so-and-so? Oh, you know who he's sleeping with, don't you? Oh, it's just. And why am I doing that? Why am I the judgmental guy? Why am I the guy that just knows what's wrong with everybody? Because if I can figure out enough of what's wrong with you, maybe I will level the playing field. And this vacancy and this sense, this vague, gnawing sense of incompleteness, I won't have to live with it as much, or at least I won't feel as so apart from as I feel. And I'm not talking about drunk. I'm talking about sober. So, I got to turn my will and my life over to the care of God, but I don't know how. I can't. I'm blocked. And that's really, I believe, what steps 4 through 9 are designed to do. They're designed to dismantle the separation between me and you and me and God. And I had this hope that I could dismantle, that I could reduce the separation between me and God, so me and God are going to be really good, but still, me and you, I could still stay like this with the idiots in the world, right? And I'll tell you so, I don't think there's any view of spiritual growth or any chance that I'll get closer to God without getting closer to you first. I don't think it's possible to me and God are like this, and me and you are like this. I think in order for me to be close to God, I have to be close to you because you are the manifestation of God in my life. The Hindus have a tremendous view of creation that I just love, and it really says something to me that matches my experience in sobriety. And their view of creation, unlike the Judeo-Christian view of Adam and Eve and the 7 days to build the world and all that, they say that God existed endlessly unto himself. And nothing else existed. And then one day, God devised this cosmic plan. And the plan was to break himself into an infinite number of parts, give all the parts amnesia, and the game is which parts are going to claim their inheritance first, which parts are going to see through the illusion of the ego and realize that there is no separation, that I am you. The Hindus call that enlightenment. When you realize that, when you discover, or as Chuck said, uncover, discover, and discard so you can get in touch with the God within you. Or as it says in our book, the great reality deep down within us. I've listened to a lot of fifth steps in sobriety. I don't even know how many, just a lot. And I've really got a clear vision that it's the same guy. It's the same person. It's me. It's me. Even the most bizarre things I have never done. The real crazy stuff, well, if I was in his shoes, that might have looked like a good deal. I don't know, Right? The illusion that I'm superior, or I would never have done that, or I'm like this, or I'm it's gone. And I think what Einstein says is right, that the great illusion of mankind is there's more than one of us here. It's the same guy. Over and over and over again. So in step 4, I'm going to start to dismantle the separation between me and you, and a funny thing happens. Did you know there's no step in the book to dismantle the separation between me and God? What happens, I dismantle the separation between me and you until I can love you as is, and God shows up. He shows up. So in step 4, we take a look at resentments. The book says resentment's the number one offender in this blockage between me and God. This is not, because I had spent so many years in therapy and I was raised a Catholic, I thought step 4 and 5 were some sort of confessional experience in beating yourself up for being wrong or bad. And it's not that at all. It's simply It's a process of uncovering, discovering, and eventually getting rid of the things between me and you and me and God, because alcoholism is a state of separation. I think the ism is I separate myself. It's the primary function of my ego. Do you ever know, to this day, if I go into a strange group of people, now it's better if they're in AA, but if they're not in AA, like if I got to go to some business gathering, I just had one on developing some land. I met with a bunch of people, attorneys and CPAs and some partners and some other people who were talking about the possibility of developing some land. And I walk in there and my first response is to feel separate from them. That is my initial response. And alcohol, I have to consciously push through that and try to be of service and shake people's hands and stuff like that in order to change that experience. But that is my nature. My nature is to live in a state of separation. Hold up in here. Hold up. So, therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. Maybe more than alcohol. When my friend Tim, with 31 and a half years, put a pistol to his head and blew his brains out, it wasn't alcohol. But he had become the guy who knew what was wrong with a lot of us. He had built the cases. He'd edged himself out of AA. After his sponsor died 7 or 8 years before he killed himself, he never got another sponsor. He had no help dismantling the judgment machine. And he eased himself out of AA over a period of several years, one person at a time. And when he was totally alone with him and his own vacancy and he couldn't take it anymore, he put a pistol to his head at 31 and a half years of sobriety. Or my friend Chuck, or my friend Mike, or Bright Eyes, or I could go on and on and on about the people I've seen, that alcohol was not even in the picture. Wasn't even in the picture. I know guys that have gone to prison with 20-some years of sobriety. Alcohol wasn't even in the picture. So it destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease. For we have not only been mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. We all get that. If you're full of resentments, your spirit does not feel well. I mean, even though we might say, I'm fine, and you're alone with yourself, you're not fine. You're not fine. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. I think that that's really true. I think the reverse is also true. I sponsored a guy for 14 years, and then he called me as sponsor another 3 until he died. But I wasn't really. And when he was a little over 14 years sober, he started doing some things that really made him sick. Instant gratification things. Sex stuff, involving the internet, and he went into some areas that could have put him in prison. He went into some and he couldn't stop doing it, and he kept it as a secret, and he got really depressed. So he got on medication, and the medication led to other medication, led to him drinking again. And I watched a man in the 3 years, or 2.5 years actually, before he drank again, I watched a guy who was in his 40s who coached soccer, who worked out at the gym, who was a tremendous specimen of vitality. He was a guy that was awake. He was bright, funny guy. And I watched him look physically sicker and sicker and sicker. Did you ever see that thing, the portrait of Dorian Gray? It was like that. It was a weird deal. As his spirit got sick by doing the things that dampen his spirit and cut him off from God and from other people, and he's developed this secret life, his whole countenance just started to change. And I was sitting in a meeting one day with another guy, sponsor Craig, and Craig says to me, he says, I haven't seen Rob in a long time. Have you seen him lately? And I said, see that guy with the walker, the cane over there? That's Rob. And he looked, he couldn't believe it. Rob, he's 50 years old, and he looks like a guy that's 90 years old dying of cancer. And he died in a couple years. And the doctors, everything started going wrong with him. Things started shutting down. It's like his The doctors didn't know what was doing this to him. Why is this guy's having, medically, he's having the worst run of bad luck they'd ever seen? I think that the reverse of what it says here is true. What it says, if it's true that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically, wouldn't it be true if I get sick spiritually, my mind and body would follow along? I think that Rob died of a spiritual malady. Doesn't say that on his death report, but I think that's what killed him. So what do we do in dealing with resentments? We set them on paper. We listed the people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. We ask ourselves why we were angry. So the columns on page 65 are three things. Who, what, where. What am I angry at? Column number 2, why, very brief, to the point. Don't get out the whole case file about all the reasons to justify your hating them. Just what's the point here? I had case files on people. Like, I remember I had a resentment towards my second grade nun. And if you would ask me, why did you hate her? I'd say, well, because she was really mean. And I think she hated boys. It must have been the vow of chastity. And, and she was mean to my friend Welly and my friend Tommy. And she was mean to Billy. And she was just always on people's back. And she was just a nasty woman. Well, that's all peripheral fluff to justify my resenting her. The real truth is one day I hadn't done my homework and she got me up in front of the class and embarrassed me in front of all the kids. That was why I resent. And then, what happens when you get a resentment? It just makes a shift in consciousness. And from that moment on, they can't do anything right. And then I think I just started building a case file, all justifying my position of playing God with them, all justifying the resentment, all keeping the juice alive. So column number 3, we're asking what's affected, threatened, hurt, or interfered with. It gives examples: sex relationships, self-esteem, pride, ambitions, security, personal relationships, etc., etc. Now, the first 3 columns of the resentment inventory are not the inventory, really. They are in a sense, but they're 50% of the deal. I start this process and I'm taking the position of the prosecuting attorney, right, with those first 3 columns. But the book is going to ask me on the next 2 pages to take a completely different view of those things. But before it does that, it has to beat me half to death with this reality of it's going to kill me. These are infinitely grave. They're going to cut me off from sunlight of spirit. The insanity of alcohol return. The drink to die. I said, enough. What do you want? Okay. And it says we were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. So now I have to take the position of the defense attorney. I have to move across the courtroom and sit at their side of the bench. Now I have to look at it through their eyes. I have to see it not through my eyes. I have to start to see it. Am I prepared to do that? And I think this is a very important question. Am I prepared to do that? Because for some of us, we'd rather be right than free. We'd rather be right than to have peace. Have I grown? Am I surrendered enough? Am I serious enough about step 3? Do I get the second half of step 1 enough to know that my perception might very well be wrong? And what I discovered, to my amazement, in step 4, the exact nature of my wrongs was not anything I thought. I thought it was the money I stole, and that's all on there, and that all goes on my 8-step list, of course, but the real exact nature of my wrongs is how wrong I had been about people. How I just pumped up and blustered my own judgment of them to keep that juice alive. Because I don't know about you guys, when I got a couple good resentments going on, I get a smug feeling of superiority towards those people. You know what I mean? I tell myself these are lies. The lies are, I'd never done that. As if I'm superior. Well, that's not true. And in the bottom of page 66, after it tells me this stuff's going to kill me, it gives me the answer. And this is so easily missed. it says, we saw that these resentments must be mastered and how we could not wish them away any more than alcohol. And I'll tell you, that's true. And I, like a lot of people, went through a phase in sobriety where I got it that I'm not supposed to have resentments. Okay, so I'm just not going to have them. Well, you just build an ulcer around that. Because you got to eat at that or gamble at that or something at that or eventually drink at that because nothing changes. Now you're just living the double life. You're living the guy who judges harshly and tries to act humbly like he doesn't. That's a tough road. So I can't wish them away any more than alcohol. You can't really. If you can, see me after the meeting because I've never been able to. So what do? It says this was our course. As a matter of fact, it's the only course it gives. It says we realized, and the word realized is a powerful word. It means that I got to make it real. There's something it's asking me here to make real. It means I got to connect the dots deep inside of me with something I've never connected the dots with before. We realized that the people who had wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Well, I get that. They're sick. And they're idiots, too. I mean, I get that. But that's not what it said. Listen, it goes on. And here's the key. It says, though we did not like their symptoms, what they did, and the way they disturbed us, I'm supposed to realize that they, like myself, were sick, too. What the hell does that mean? That means I got to get down off the throne of judgment, off my high horse, and I got to see how I'm like this person. I got to see how if I was afraid like they were afraid, maybe if I grew up and was abused the way they were abused, maybe if I had all the emotional stuff going on inside of me that's going on inside of them, could I have suffered from that malady of the spirit to such an extent? Can I get it that I could have done to someone else what they did to me? Can I see that? Can I see that I could ease that on a bad day, if I had their background, I could have been that guy? And I'll tell you something, when I started to get that and realize it, I started viewing these people completely different. And I started realizing something that I absolutely believe beyond a shadow of a doubt. That everyone I've ever hurt and everyone that's ever hurt me, we all reap the same reward within ourselves. We cover it up with bluster. We cover it up with defense mechanisms. But I started to understand and actually even have some compassion for some of the people that had hurt me because intuitively I started to know the price they paid even though you couldn't see it on the outside because it's the exact same price that I would pay. The illusion of the ego is that I'm separate. Is it, well, they got away with it. No, there's no free lunch here. There's no free lunch. And when I was able to do that, I'll tell you, some amazing things started happening in my life. I started to really claim my sense of humanity and become a part of here. And as I started to dismantle the judgment machine in this, that is the essence of my will, is really, this is the part that's designed to dismantle the thing that keeps me separate from you and keeps me ultimately separate from God. And I started to become a part of, really for the first time in my life. And the book later says our maximum purpose is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. It is through this that I started really being able to be a good sponsor because now I get you. Because you're me. You're me. You're me on a bad day maybe, but you're me. But you're me. Right? And I'll tell you something I've learned. I know this beyond a shadow of doubt. There is not an action that has ever been perpetrated by one individual on another, no matter how hideous, that under the right set of circumstances, with the right amount of emotions, putting the screws to me and drugs and alcohol and background, that if I was in their shoes, there's nothing I'm incapable of doing. And there's a lot of things I haven't done, I've heard in Fifth Steps, and it's not because of virtue. It's because of circumstances. You see, I believe that if I walk down the street that you walk down, I will see what you'd see and I will react to it like you reacted. And I'll end up at the end of that block the same guy that you ended up at the end of that block. I will be you. And if I walk down certain streets, it's not because I'm a good guy. It's not because I'm superior. It's because of circumstances. It just, when they spun the wheel for what's happening in Bob's life today, it didn't come up. Something else came up. I tell you, when I got to my 8-step list, one of the things that became very clear and true for me, and if it's true for me, it has to be true for you. Because we're either all God's kids or none of us are. It's got to be, it can't be my case is special and different. And what I saw in my 8-step list, I heard a lot of people. A lot of people. Honest to God, there was not one person on that list, not one, that I set out to consciously hurt. I was driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-pity. I stepped on the toes of my fellows, and they retaliated. I hurt a lot of people. And if that's true for me, could I believe that that would be true for you? Can I see myself in you? And I tell you, this part of this process has turned my life around more than anything. And then there's a prayer. And I think the prayer is very important. And it's an interesting prayer because it involves action. It says we ask God to help us to show them. That means act towards them, demonstrate towards them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. I had a guy years ago, he had a resentment towards a guy at work, and I had him saying that prayer. I said, I want you to say that prayer for that guy every day. And a couple weeks, I guess, went by, and he hadn't mentioned it. And I was at a meeting. I said, so what happened to that resentment? And he looked at me like, what resentment? I said, the guy at work. He said, oh, yeah. He said, I don't have it anymore, so it's work. Him and I are good today. I said, what happened? He said, well, I started saying that prayer, asking God to help me to show him the same patience, pity, and tolerance I'd cheerfully grant a sick friend. And after about 2 days of saying that, I started to fantasize. I started having this fantasy. And the fantasy was, what if I found out that this guy had a brain tumor that was making him uptight and on the muscle at work and adversarial for people? What if it was some sort of strange Tourette syndrome that was making him do that and he couldn't help it? How would I view him? And he says, then I'd realize, well, God, I wouldn't be so uptight about the guy. Then I'd feel sorry for himself. I'd be trying to be helpful. And then he said to himself, well, what's the difference? When I've had emotional deformities and I've stepped on people's toes, I never meant to. I couldn't help it. And maybe this really is an honest deal here. Maybe these people, this guy who's been stepping on my toes, maybe he can't help it. Because if I was in his shoes and I was acting like him, well, how would I feel? And he said to me, the guy has no friends. He's totally alone. He's walled himself off, and he can't help it. And he started to see himself in this part. I'll tell you a quick little story, and we'll take a break. I'll end this part, and I'll do one more thing, I'll take a break. Years ago, I was doing a 5th step with a guy, and he was sober a couple years, and we get to this part. This was our course in a resentment that's about 1/3 of the way through, and this was the worst resentment the guy had. It was towards his father. And what the situation? His father was a bad drunk. I mean, a really bad drunk, and his father used to beat him. I mean, to the point where he'd end up in emergency rooms. His father sometimes would stop drinking, but then he'd be so irritable, it was almost worse because he'd yell and scream and get to your room and shut up, and I don't want to hear any crap from you. And his father would just debase him and just discount him over and over and over again. And then occasionally, on rare occasions, a couple times his father tried to get sober, and he'd make these grandiose promises. I'm going to get you a bicycle, or I'm going to take you to Disneyland. It's going to be different. Then his father would drink again, and all the rage would come out of him, and he'd get beaten again. The beatings would start. And we get to this resentment. He's talking about this. And this is a resentment that has owned him his whole life. It's affected his ability to have relationships. It's affected his ability he finally had to work for himself because he couldn't work for anybody because he had this authority thing going on. So he had to have his own little business because he couldn't get along with people. He'd been in therapy for something close to 8 years. He beat pillows. He did the Gestalt chair with his father. He did all that stuff, and nothing changed. And we get to this was our course, and I said to him, I said, you got to realize, you got to get it how you're like your dad. And he got pissed at me. And he said, I'm not. He started yelling at me. I'm not like my fucking. And I just backed off. I get, this guy is not prepared to look at this from an entirely different angle. I thought he was going to hit me. He got so offended by the implication that he was like his father. So I just moved on. I just said, okay, let's just go on to the next resentment. And he starts getting into this next resentment, and I can't hear him because something's going on in me. And what I think's going on is a result of a prayer I said, and I always say before I listen to a fifth step, I ask God to help me be useful. And as my friend Bob B. from Minneapolis says, I never am the well, but sometimes I get to be the pipe. And what came out of me next was not of me, was through me, because I'm not this smart, really, I'm not. And I stopped him in the middle of this next resentment. I said, I want to go back to something else. And he said, yeah, you want to talk about my father? No, I don't. I want to go back to that relationship at the beginning, the one where those kids were involved. He says, what of it? I said, I just was wondering if any time in that deal with those kids, if you were ever drunk or stoned on drugs or hung over, where you ever did anything to hurt those kids. And he got this weird look on his face, and he hung his head down. And I remember this like it was yesterday. As he brought his head up, he had tears running down his face, and this choked, pained whisper from the depths of hell. He said, I'm just like my goddamn father. I said, how did you feel about yourself when you hurt those kids? He said, I couldn't stay drunk enough. I said, you think your dad's any different? And he got a funny look on his face, and he said, you know something? My dad lives in a little trailer all by himself. I haven't seen him in years. My family won't have anything to do with him. He's the most lonely, negative, fear-filled, depressed, uncomfortable person. He's all by himself. His liver is going out on him. He's got pancreatitis. He physically can't drink. He's been physically, by a body that won't metabolize alcohol, been forced into a state of abstinence. He's the most miserable person on the planet. I said, you think you could be like that? He said, without Alcoholics Anonymous, that is my future. And he was able to go and make amends to his father. And I remember him telling the story to me quite a few weeks later. He had to go to another town, and he said he was scared to death. He said he was literally trembling in front of that trailer. And he was trembling because he was afraid of the monster that was going to answer that door. And he said what answered the door was a scared little old man who was shaken and alone. And he looked in his father's eyes and he saw himself. And he was able to take care of his dad. And he'll tell you to this day that the greatest thing Alcoholics Anonymous ever gave him next to his abstinence was it got his daddy back. This is a powerful, powerful thing. This other-centered stance that is supposed to be taken by a self-centered person, that I could become that other-centered. And then the last thing it says is putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. I used to say this in AA. I used to tell the guys I sponsor this, and I hear people share it all the time when they're talking about this part of the book. They say, well, we're looking for our part. I think that's a bad deal. The reason is if I'm looking for my part, there's an implication there. There's my part, this little tiny, and there's another part over here. You know what I mean? They got a part too, right? There's no part here. There's no part. We're disregarding the other person involved entirely, putting out of our minds the wrongs that they've done. There's no part. There's you. There's you. And when you look at it that way, it's different. See, I am capable of hiding my bad behavior in the shadow of your bad behavior. And which means I don't look at my own bad behavior in its own light. Now I have to look at what, I can't look at what kind of son I was in the light of everything my parents did wrong. I had to look at what kind of son I was as if my parents were perfect. Oh, Then I'm not, that's not good. Because when you start doing that, you can just feel your 8-step list growing. It's just, you know what I mean? It's bad. It's bad. But that's what the book says. And I think that it's a bad deal for me, personally, to use anything you've done wrong to justify anything I've done wrong. And I made a career of that. If I worked at a place and I could find the boss doing something wrong or out of line, man, that was almost licensed to steal. If I was in a relationship and I heard and the gal went out with some other guy or slept with another guy, that was like 5 get some free tickets. You know what I mean? Right? But I used your behavior, the thing that your imperfections, to justify and hold up a whole bunch of stuff. The book's saying I can't do that no more. It's got to stop here. Putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had I been selfish with this person? Where had I been dishonest? Where had I been self-seeking and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely my fault, I tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where was I to blame? And for some of us, this is the first time really in our life that we come out from behind the wrongdoings of others and stand up in the light and take the responsibility. No more justifications, no more rationalizations. I had a great teacher when I was in my early sobriety, a guy named Dale, who died from cancer with a lot of years of sobriety, maybe 20 years ago or so. And Dale, I remember Dale was a finger pointer. And I just loved, he was a happy guy, but he always looked gruff, one of those kind of old timers. I remember one time he's pointing at me, he says, "Listen, kid, I want you to realize if you're defending something, if you're rationalizing something, if you're justifying something, kid, I want you to get it that you're wrong. Because you never have to defend, justify, or rationalize what's right." I never forgot that. And in this process, in the 4th step, Dale's words rang out within me many times. Let's take a 5 to 7 minute break, and then we'll come back here and finish up this deal of unblocking the channel.